right, hello and welcome everybody. My name is Jack Ader. I am the Wilderness Ranger for the Bitterroot National Forest. I've been on the Bitterroot for a few years now, but I've also worked in Salmon Chalice National Forest and in the Sawtooth National Recreation Area. Working there, I one time, met 100 people on one particular day at one of those backcountry lakes. So I have a little bit of experience in public contacts. Excited to be here today to talk about wisdom and art.
Hey, and so again, I am Jimmy Gaudry. I'm the Wilderness and Wild Scenic Rivers Program Manager for the Northern region. I've been doing Wilderness and Wild Scenic Rivers work since 1993, so that's almost 30 years. I started off as a volunteer wilderness ranger and worked for 15 years or so as a seasonal and field going positions. And I just want to say that really, I've done this training off and on over the years. And one reason I really like it is because when I started working as a volunteer with the Forest Service, I didn't have maybe the strongest background to do the work we do. I grew up in an urban area. We did not camp a lot when I was growing up. We certainly didn't backpack, and I had never stepped foot in a wilderness area until I started working for the Forest Service. And so having, I guess I would say I slipped into a volunteer position out of desperation for the forest. I had someone quit last minute, and I happened to be there on the scene, and was immediately thrust into making public contacts in the field and trying to explain and interpret natural resource conditions. And so with that, I'll admit I'm a bit rusty in using art and wisdom in the context of field work. But I also want to connect it to some of the themes that we've been talking about this week. I feel like these communication skills are great for field work, but they also connect to a lot of the other relationships and work we do. And even you'll see we talk about why in some of this. We want to spend time thinking about why as we interpret. And I think that certainly connects to what we talked about on Monday with the This Is Who We Are session. So I want to put in a quick plug though, and just talk about kind of how we're going to go through this today. This is a photo from 2019. It's the Northern Rockies Wilderness Skills Institute, which was an in-person version of what we're doing here today. And, so typically we would do this type of training in person. And our goal today is to not only just share with you what these communication techniques are, but we're going to provide you with some handouts, some tools, some other information that you can use when you go back to your unit and or wherever you work and share with those that you work with.
All right, so let's get started talking about wisdom and art. So wisdom is a systematic 6-step process for professional and safe public contacts, whereas the authority of the resource is a 3-step interpretation interpretation process for educating the public about the resource. Now, to be clear, these are not to be used in lieu of official forest protection officer training or law enforcement training, but they're supposed to be used to augment that. So let's get started first about the wisdom process. So the wisdom process was first developed by Ralph Swain, who is a retired Forest Service Regional Wilderness Program Manager. And the story goes that he was confronted by his district ranger once and said, what do you do out there? And he said, well, why don't you come out with me and find out? And eventually the district ranger went out with him and was very impressed with the way that he communicated to the public. And the ranger said, well, I really like you to come up with something that I can give to a new person so that they will be able to engage the public just as well as you have. So he started to develop something, and then he advanced that with his graduate degree from Colorado State University. and created this wisdom process. And we've been teaching this since the 1990s. So when do we use wisdom? Well, we know that the Wilderness Act says that wilderness should be administered for the use and enjoyment of the American people, and that one of the purposes is recreation. So we will use this wisdom technique in the wilderness, but I want to be clear that it's not exclusive to wilderness alone, that you would use this process whenever you come into contact with the public, or even you could use this in the office. So people go to the wilderness for a wilderness experience. They go for recreation and to connect with family and friends, find solitude and self-reliance. They usually don't come to the wilderness with untoward behavior, and they don't come with malice to do harm. Most impact is usually out of a lack of knowledge or skill. Okay, so what is the application of wisdom again? So we're probably most used to using wisdom in public contact scenarios such as formal ranger patrols, whether they're forest protection officer patrols or law enforcement capacities, where we might be writing violation notices for those particular behaviors we were just talking about. But there are other folks, volunteers that do patrols that don't necessarily have that law enforcement capacity. And, you might be on a backcountry trail crew or otherwise, fire crew, whatever, that you might be able to use this wisdom technique to make better public contacts. And so some of the violations that you all noted are similar to the ones that Ralph Swain in his thesis, his master's thesis, he discovered in Colorado. Dogs off leash, camping violations, campfire violations, group size violations, similar to what you all have put down. And in that same study, he got top 3 reasons for violating. One was, I didn't think I was hurting anything, or he got this a lot. The topography of the land made it impossible to comply. The slopes on the side of the lake were too steep. The only place to camp was within 200 feet of the water. Or people would say, I was unaware of the regulation. So let's go ahead and take a look at the wisdom process itself. So it's an acronym and stands for: where are you coming from? Introduce yourself, size up the situation, decide on a course of action, outline and explain the regulation, and then make a positive impression. So the W, the first part, where are you coming from? We want to be prepared to make our first public contact of our patrol. And that means we need to forget about what happened yesterday or this morning when you're trying to get ready for the trailhead, or that you're tired or you stayed up too late packing. You want to be ready for those contacts. Visitors deserve the best of you. Try and be focused. Also, part of this, where are you coming from? We need to consider what kind of unconscious bias we might have. This might relate to some of the other topics we've discussed this week in the National Wilderness Skills Institute. Once the photos illustrate one such bias, gear bias, we might expect people to, have the proper gear. And if we see someone hiking out there in tennis shoes, we immediately jump to the conclusion that they don't know what they're doing. They shouldn't be out here, and they are probably going to break some rule or regulation or follow terrible leave no trace practices. But that's not necessarily the case. So we talked about the W, where are we coming from? Well, the next step in this wisdom process is to introduce yourself. Professionally introduce yourself. And if you're wearing a uniform, that helps introduce yourself. Be aware of your uniform and your appearance. I had one wilderness manager who would ask us to keep one clean shirt in our backpack. When you're out there as a wilderness ranger cleaning up fire rings and doing trail work, you get a little dirty. And she would say, have a clean uniform, and when it counts and you need to have a lengthy public contact, or you're coming into a big group, throw on your clean uniform, and it makes a little bit of a difference. So also be respectful of visitors' space and time. If it is a wilderness setting, they're not there to interact with the ranger. They're out there for their own wilderness values and don't necessarily want to be talking with you or being around you. So respect that space and time. Next, the S, size up the situation. You know, this is similar to some of the training you might receive in a force protection officer course, but you know, before the encounter, scope the area, understand the situation, begin sizing up the situation before you make contact, figure out what you're walking into and how you think it might how it might go. And it's great to have a partner to be your second set of eyes and ears as well. Next, the D, decide on a course of action. If it's an educational contact, inform and inspire people. If it's a violation or a warning, be prepared to act accordingly. Have your violation ticket book out. You know what you're about to write or what you're about to say. And capitalize on that teachable moment. Might be a great opportunity because the individuals simply don't know that they've done something wrong or that their behavior was undesirable. It's your opportunity to show them your passion for the resource and explain to them how you feel about it. O, outline and explain the regulation. Explain the regulation and explain why the rule is important. And this is where the authority of the resource that Jimmy is going to talk about is going to come into play. And this is where you can explain the need for compliance and how you feel about it as well. And again, remember to draw attention to the resource and not the uniform. And we'll get into that in just a minute. And practice it. And then finally, make a positive impression. Always conduct yourself professionally. Be prepared, be concise. Try to leave the visitor with a positive impression of why it's important to protect the wilderness resource. I remember one time of the few violation notices tickets I've ever written was to a group of Boy Scouts who were oversized group. And at the end of the conversation of the contact, they actually thanked me and were glad that they stopped and told me about it. And then they went back and wrote a note to my supervisor telling them that how grateful they were that they ran into me. So you never know when, you know, your interaction can actually improve the relations with other people and entities. And then just a note on ranger safety. You can turn up the squelch on your radio that lets people know that you've got a lifeline out there. Always use we and not I. Don't ever give your camp location away, and try to know where your escape route is just in case something happens. And you can see my friend Adam there on the lake. He's being safe out there.
Okay, hopefully you all got a chuckle out of that photo. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the photos as we go forward, but let's talk a little bit about the authority of the resource technique now, or ART. So this is a picture of Dr. George Wallace. He was my advisor at Colorado State University. And he, along with being a professor at the University of Colorado State University, he also taught many different ranger trainings, both internationally and within the US. And we may have a few folks on here from the Poudre Wilderness Volunteers. He was pretty instrumental in helping them get started back in the 90s. And I think has taught this authority of the resource technique year after year, probably with their group, which is a large volunteer cadre of wilderness ranger folks working in the Poudre Wilderness. Again, I feel like ART is a great process for making public contacts in what can be often a challenging circumstance. Add on to my story about not having a ton of experience in the natural resources arena, talking to people in situations where we're asking them to do something different, or maybe even accusing them of doing something that we believe is wrong, can just be tense in itself. And so having tools like this and practicing is meant to help us relieve some of that tension as we go into those public contacts. I also want to state that, you know, given the dialogue that we've had this week, some of the assumptions we made back in the 90s related to the authority of the resource technique, especially demographics and assumptions related to that are probably ripe for reevaluating. We've been teaching this system for 30 something years now, and it's based on some foundations on who we assume our visitors are. And I guess as I think about it more and more, those might still hold true, but it certainly seems like a great opportunity for us to rethink some of that and make sure that as we're using these tools that they are indeed the best they can be. So law enforcement and the authority of the resource technique. To start, Dr. Wallace originally published this article on the right back in 1990. And again, when we get to the end here, we'll drop a series of things into the chat, and all of this will be available when we post these recordings. But we're going to take a little bit deeper dive into what George had in this article. Overall, he used this to share some examples of different types of ranger contacts, and he did some contrasting of what a typical law enforcement contact might be versus one focused more on interpretation. He also discussed the use of body language and referred to a common teaching style where you stand shoulder to shoulder, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. And then he discussed the use of focusing on what people find interesting, right? And so, apologies, I'm going to turn my camera back on there. So focusing on, for us, what people find interesting when we're making a public contact in the field is typically the natural world around us. And so his thought was, let's use that and focus on that when we make these contacts. So a few other assumptions or key points from his article is he believed that wild nature can be said to have its own authority, right? Nature has her own rules, operates in certain ways, and has certain laws, and that there are consequences when we violate that order. He stated that wilderness areas, and we know this, are among the few places on Earth where we have agreed to allow nature, for the most part, to operate on her own terms. He described that much of the undesirable behavior that we address within wilderness as behavior that disrupts the natural order or the ability of others to experience wild nature. And then it's worth noting that throughout the rest of this session, I'm going to use the term undesirable behavior instead of against the law or against the regulation. And that's with intent. Not everything that we contact people about in the backcountry, in wilderness, on wild scenic rivers is necessarily illegal. We know that Leave No Trace presents a set of ethics. And so we're trying to instill those ethics. And oftentimes these contexts revolve around that. So this photo, just to highlight, this is how we might typically teach an art and wisdom session, using some props we can bring outside. We're typically working with staff who are used to being outside, and so create that comfortable space and audience size if possible. And again, the idea is that this is something you can try out after we're done today and practice and use where you work, or even bring it into the field and practice. So let's talk a little bit about the authority of the agency, though. And I'm not sure that all of us even feel that we have the authority of the agency behind us. If you're a volunteer or a partner, you may be representing your partner entity, but certainly when we're working in partnership with you, you're representing the agency as well, right? And so for me, I know that I'm representing the Forest Service when I'm out in the field, and when I'm in uniform, I can assume that people believe that. So I remember when I first started working for the agency, I didn't have what we call forest protection officer training, or in other agencies, they have law enforcement, a different type of training than the Forest Service. I remember being taught the laws and the regulations for the areas that I worked in. I remember hearing the term gain compliance. And if I hadn't had any other training, I would have left that believing that my job was to let people know what the law or regulation was and convince them to do the right thing, either using a warning or a citation. And that would be an easy path for me to have gone and making my public contacts. I think what we're trying to propose here is, as we look at those undesirable behaviors, and some of them won't be laws necessarily, that we have another option. And that using that technique can oftentimes leave the visitor thinking about the laws and the regulations and badges rather than the environment that they're in. And we need to ask ourselves if that's the type of impression we want to leave visitors with. So enough on the authority of the agency. Let's talk a bit about the authority of the resource technique. When we start using art, the idea is to work to transfer the authority from the agency to the resource. We really want to de-emphasize the regulation in favor of interpreting. And in this picture, we picked this picture out with intent, right? If you came across this scene in an area you were recreating, I think it would automatically give you that sense of the authority of the resource. You have someone who's out there cleaning up an impact left by a visitor, and I believe that most visitors would feel that they did not want to be the person leaving that impact there. So art includes 3 steps. And by breaking it into 3 steps, we try and make it easier for you when you're thinking of a lot of other things. So let's jump into those steps. First, you want to give an objective description of the situation. You open up the conversation with something like hi, hello. If you're in uniform, it's clear that you are representing the agency. And you want to try and make an objective statement about the situation. I noticed that the campsite is set up near the lake, for example. Next, you want to highlight what you've observed. And this is where you as field staff get to interpret, right? Note that, again, we're going to provide you with a list of materials here, but in our example, we might say something like, we often see moose traveling near this lake at this time of year. Many people come here during the day and we hear complaints about tents set up near a lake. And so going back to our example, we have someone who's set up their tent very near a lake in our area. And then the third step, this is where you tell them how you feel about what you see and what can or should be done to improve this situation. We as stewards of the land, we should be interested and concerned in the resource and be able to convey that. And it's acceptable at this point to talk about how you feel and that the implications of the behavior and what might happen. In our example, we might say something like, I would feel better if we knew that this particular moose could make her way to the lake here. That's providing a connection that you actually know the consequence of their behavior and that something's going to happen if we continue down the road we're on. And again, since you're wearing a uniform, and that uniform might be an agency uniform or it might be that of a partner organization, the visitor can assume that what you're stating about how you feel is also how the agency feels about the behavior. And it's at this point where we may need to make a decision about regulations or not. Do we want to talk about the regulation that might exist around this behavior? And again, connecting to another session in the visitor use management session, the one Linda Merigliano did, she referenced leave no trace and research on why people are often creating impacts. And the things that she listed were careless behavior, unskilled behavior, uninformed behavior, unavoidable, and then illegal. And so of those, I think we're going to do an assessment as we make a contact, and if it falls into that unskilled, uninformed, unavoidable behavior, or even careless, that those seem like prime opportunities for us to use the authority of the resource technique. If it's something that's clearly illegal and someone intentionally doing something wrong, then we might take a different tact. But this is the point where we can interject that regulation if it makes sense, or again, we can stay focused on the authority of the resource and focus on resource concerns. So, and then I just wanted to put in one last plug, and it's a plug for having field staff who really know their area. There's lots of value in us knowing the area that we work, because it helps us to better interpret things. And an example that I have is going to a restaurant and having a waiter who's serving you, who, if you ask a question about a certain dish, can say, oh yeah, I tried that dish and here's what I thought of it. Here's what you can expect, versus a waiter or a waitress who possibly doesn't have that perception or perspective and can't share maybe what you're ordering and what it tastes like. They just don't know. And so the idea is for you to be able to speak from experience and share that experience with a visitor. So there are some additional techniques. Sometimes it can feel like a lot to think about, and again, practice helps. But in addition to the messaging and the 3 steps, you want to give the person the benefit of the doubt. It could be that it's it's their first time having a backpacking trip, and they're new to this type of activity. It could be that someone else caused the impact that you're looking at. Don't assume that the person you're talking to has done what you're addressing. It's important to show consideration and tact, and so think about that as you're giving the person the benefit of the doubt. You want to take the time to build the rapport with the person you're approaching. They may be new again to traveling or camping in the outdoors and don't have experience and leave no trace or minimizing impacts. Back to that side-by-side, standing posture. Again, it can be confrontational for some people to be in a more eye-to-eye approach. And so ideally, and this is what will be hard to practice over a virtual format, but standing side by side and focusing on that resource that is of concern to both of you is the ideal way to make a contact. And again, want to reinforce safety. That's only if it's safe. For those who've been through some sort of law enforcement training, you're taught to think about your safety in certain situations. And I would say the same for others. Keep your distance if that makes sense. Stay eye to eye if that's the safe approach. But in most of our contacts, we find that this shoulder to shoulder approach can be used. Educate. You want to teach people the reason why their impact is affecting the environment. So take that time to educate them. And then lastly, give them an alternative. Again, people might just not know what the alternative is. And so try to provide them with something that's different from what they're doing, even to the extent of if it's a campsite issue, if they need a better one. Again, it goes back to, if you know your area, you could probably point them to where there's a great campsite. If not, taking the time to walk around with them will go a long way in changing behavior over the long run versus just this contact. So I've said this a few times. We have a number of resources we're going to provide to you. Honestly, right now I have 3 screens open, and so I can't drop them into the chat box. But as soon as we transition over into doing some scenarios, I'll throw those into the chat box, and those will be there for you. And then when this is posted on the recordings, we'll also have all this stuff posted there as well. And so with that, we promised you an interactive session here. And so we want to kind of do our best to go through a few scenarios and talk through how we would typically do this on the field, in the field. And so so what I want to do now is present you with the first of 3 scenarios. And I'm wondering if we're going to be soliciting volunteers from you all to help with this. But I think I had 2 people who had already volunteered for this first one. I'm looking to see if they're with us though. Patrick and Ben, are you indeed here?
I don't see them unless they have a different name.
Okay. The downside to asking someone ahead of time to volunteer is that they might not show up. So with that though, I guess I know a number of you in the audience. I just scrolled through the rosters. So and I know you're not bashful. And I know some of you have done this before, and so reaching out for help here. Typically how we would do this is it's important for us. I think it builds empathy for us to stand in the visitor's spot for scenarios as well as in the ranger's role, so that we can practice making these contacts. And so what we typically do is we ask someone to step up and be the quote unquote ranger in a scenario. We ask someone to step up and be the visitor. And so I'm looking for volunteers to take on one of those roles in this first scenario. Pete Irvin, thank you. Got Jack or I can take on a role. Jack, are you interested in being a ranger or a visitor? We should let Pete pick first since he volunteered.
Okay.
Hey, Pete, what would you like to do here?
True. I'll be on my first ever backpacking trip into the Selway Bitterroot wilderness.
Excellent. So with that, I think you've read your role. If you would go ahead and share your role with the group, so I know they have it in front of them, but so that we're all on the same page, and then Jack will do the same, and we will jump into a quick role-playing scenario here in our virtual setting.
All right. So I'm on my first ever backpacking trip into the Selway Bitterroot wilderness. I've hiked 8 miles today and I am pretty tired. I look for a campsite and I find one right off the trail, 50 feet, next to a lake, 25 feet, with amazing views. I set up my camp as a few other people looking for campsites hike by, and it feels a little odd having people walk right through my camp spot, but I'm tired and I'm setting up my tent.
Okay, and I'm on my first wilderness hit for the season. I'm looking forward to getting into the field, and I've set up camp, decided to do a patrol around the popular lake. And as I approach the lake, I see someone setting up camp right next to the trail in the lake. The Selway Bitterroot Wilderness does not have any regulations about camping too close to the trail or water, but I know that the L&T principle is 200 feet from the water, and that the presence of a camp so close to the trail could impact the experience of others. So I decided to approach the camp to discuss this. So I'm walking up. Hi, how are you? I'm Jack Ader. How's it going?
Oh, hey, hi. Doing pretty well. Pretty much tuckered, but doing pretty good.
What an amazing view, huh?
Oh, it's fantastic.
So you're from around here? You come here often?
No, first time ever. Heard about it for a while and finally took the plunge. Not really my thing, but glad I did it.
Good. Well, I'm glad you could be here. So I'm the wilderness ranger for the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness. And this is one of the lakes I come up and check out every once in a while. I noticed you have your camp set up right here.
Yeah, I'm actually pretty surprised that nobody else got here before me.
Yeah, well, there might be a few other people around. I think they might be a little further away, but Well, so one of the things that we like to do at this particular lake, because it does get kind of busy, is I usually try to set up camp a little bit further from the water. There are a couple of reasons for that. One is that sometimes we're a little messy in camp and we don't want to get any of our, I don't know, any of our camp mess into the lake. And another reason is that we do get quite a bit of use up here. And sometimes it hurts other people's experience, just like you came up here to get out and have this nice, beautiful lake to camp next to. Other people want to do the same, but unfortunately, when we camp too close to it, other people don't get that same wilderness experience that you're looking for and that I'm looking for.
So, am I breaking a rule?
You're not breaking any rules necessarily. I don't know if you've heard of the principles of leave no trace or not before.
Well, sure. Pack it in, pack it out. I always do that.
Yeah, that's a good one. Another principle of leave no trace is sort of an ethic that we try to live by is camping at least 200 feet from lakes and other water bodies. And like I said, that's just to, one, keep our food and other camping mess from getting into that water and spoiling that pristine nature of that lake. So yeah, it would be really cool if you could pick up your camp. And in fact, I know that there is a really great little platform not too far from here and 200 feet from the lake. And it might even have a better view than you have now. Would you mind moving? I'll even help you.
Oh, dude, I wish you'd have showed up about 20 minutes ago. But I guess that makes sense. I'll be pretty bummed out if I walk back by here tomorrow and see that somebody scored this place after I did the right thing.
Well, you know what? I'll tell you what, if they try to do that, I'll explain to them exactly what I explained to you. And there's another spot I'll take them to.
Well, sounds reasonable, and I appreciate your help.
Yeah, I appreciate you moving. Here, I'll help you pack up. Thanks a bunch.
All right.
Hey, nice job, Jack and Pete, and a round of applause for you for doing that. Did realize it probably would have been helpful to do some Q&A before. And so what I guess I'd like to combine is like, boy, if you have some questions about the information that we presented and or some comments about what Jack and Pete first just did, either what you thought went well or what you thought could have been better, you're free to either type things in the chat box, which Jack, I can't see the chat box, so I'll look to you to grab those, or if you want to speak up, everyone has the ability to take themselves off of mute for this session, so feel free to jump in. Peter, Jack, how do you think it went?
Jack's a little bit intimidating even over Zoom.
What? I'll keep that in mind. Someone mentioned that Pete was unusually compliant. Yeah, you were compliant for the sake of this scenario. I appreciate that. It doesn't necessarily go that easily.
It doesn't, and I think the time, the time it takes to do something like help someone find another campsite. I think we had a discussion about this in another situation. Like, it's often easier to put your blinds on and go take care of a task that you have on your to-do list. But in that spirit of stewarding the whole, taking the time to address other things besides maybe what is on that task list. And visitor contacts is for most of us a part of our jobs, and hopefully we can put the time in as needed. Pete, I see you on camera. Do you have something else to add?
Well, just, I appreciate the reality of the scenario. A lot of times we kind of sugarcoat scenarios. This would have been a much easier scenario if indeed the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness did have an official regulation with some distances. And, you know, at that point, I would have walked past something that told me no camping within X amount of feet, or don't camp here. But, you know, in reality, I think a lot of visitor contacts are in the gray where this one was, right? Jack's trying to introduce me to something I may not know and get me to do the right thing that is not technically a legal requirement.
Thanks, Pete. And surprisingly, I mean, I think when I first started with the agency, Forest Service, we don't have standard regulations for that type of thing in every area. So on top of expecting visitors to maybe know what the ethics are or what the rules are, knowing that they can go from one wilderness to another and there are going to be different rules in place, and have them know that is sometimes asking a lot. I think yesterday we also had a session on communication, and ideally a lot of that communication on rules, regulations, expectations we're doing before the visitor gets to this point. But we know from experience that often time as well is not the case.
There's a question. Bridget says, as someone new to a ranger position, I'm wondering what some tips are for navigating a scenario where someone might not be quite as compliant.
Yeah, go ahead, Jack.
Well, then someone followed it up and asked if you were an FPO or a law enforcement, or if you're just a ranger, and that can really matter. But before that, you know, before you're a even if you're not an FPO or law enforcement, and you might transition into, you know, the authority of the agency at that point, and, you know, try to enforce behavior with a citation. You know, I don't know. There maybe, I think the where you're coming from and building the rapport goes a long way to begin with. And the longer you can build rapport, the more compliance you might get in the end. Also, it is fairly difficult to, you know, use the authority of the resource, but if you can do it well and people can understand exactly why they should do a certain thing, they'll be more compliant. So with practice, with tact, you know, it might not be as compliant, but the more you explain, the more you can try to, like, I don't know, be friendly about it. You might get more compliance before you have to then essentially use the authority of the agency and say, okay, well, if you won't move, then I'm going to write you a citation. Jimmy, what else would you add to that?
Yeah, it's challenging. And certainly, again, we're building using art, and I credit George for the acronym ART, right? There's an art to knowing when maybe you've had the threshold of education, interpretation is not going to change the behavior of the visitor. And that's when, if your next tool is to issue a warning or a citation, that's what you pull out of your toolbox. Even if you can issue a warning or a citation, right, though, someone might say, go ahead and give me a ticket, I'm not moving. And at some point, I think we're all taught that that might be the time where you just move on. Honestly, it's not going to be the end of the world if you have someone who stays there. If it is a really big deal, you'll probably have a way to at least call it in and get the next level of support needed for that type of contact. But I think for the majority of the things we're addressing, there is a time and place where you might just step away and move on. Hey, so I do want to try the next scenario, and I'm hopeful that we can find a couple of volunteers out there. I did drop into the chat box a number of cheat sheet stuff that can help. It's those materials we were talking about. So looking to see if anyone's interested in practicing the visitor or the ranger role in this one. And I'll kind of highlight it for you. This one's in my backyard. The visitor role, you've just moved to this neighborhood and it abuts national forest land. Spring has arrived. You decide to go for a mountain bike ride on the trail near your house. You ride for about 30 minutes. And then you notice a sign that says Rattlesnake Wilderness. You're going too fast to notice what it says underneath. You have no idea what a wilderness is, but you think to yourself, how cool is this? And then you notice a ranger headed your way on foot and slow down. Probably because you haven't seen a wilderness ranger before. A ranger role, you're a wilderness ranger in the Rattlesnake Wilderness. You have spent the day checking on work that is being done on a dam in the wilderness. I'm throwing all kinds of cool stuff in this one. You're headed out down the trail and you see a mountain biker headed to your way. You're about 2 miles from the wilderness boundary and you approach the mountain biker. And so from the visitor standpoint, I'll say what we tried to throw in here is that we often have areas that are great mountain biking that might eventually lead to a wilderness. And oftentimes our signing is small and can go unnoticed. And for a ranger, we have these dam projects here that they're a big deal. And you've just spent your entire day doing this. You're headed out though, you're headed to your car. It's probably late in the day. And you're ready to head home. And so there's a lot of like challenges that tie in both like the wisdom part and the art on where you're coming from on this. And so anyone want to take this on as a scenario?
Tim. Great.
Tim?
That's me.
All right. Hey, Tim, thank you. Someone want to work with Tim on this one? All right. I'll do this one with you. And I'll give you, again, since you raised your hand, you get the choice if you want to be a visitor or a ranger.
Oh yeah, I'd love to be the visitor.
All right. So let's jump in. I don't think we need to go through our roles again. I think you kind of know where you're coming from, where I'm coming from, right?
Yeah, got it.
So you're riding, I would say, hey, how you doing? You have a minute to talk?
Yeah, what's up?
Hey, thanks, stop. I know, boy, this is a great afternoon for a bike ride. I can't wait to get home myself, to be honest, to hop on my bike, and this is a great area to ride in. Hey, I wondered if you saw the wilderness boundary sign back there on your way in.
Yeah, is that what that was? I was going pretty fast.
Yeah, I know, this is a fast trail. Yeah, are you familiar with what wilderness is?
Well, I just moved into this area, so I know. I saw this on a website as a good ride, so I thought I'd come down and check it out.
You bet. Hey, yeah, there's a lot of great website stuff out there. Hey, actually, that wilderness boundary sign had some information below it. And this area, because it's designated wilderness, mountain bikes, any sort of motorized or mechanized travel is not allowed. The reason why is that we're trying to provide a certain experience for those who are visiting the area. And so we have tons of mountain bike trails that lead up to here, and there's even some great loops. But once you hit that wilderness boundary sign, you really kind of need to either look for another option or, boy, if you look at, was it trails.org here in Missoula, they have a great set of loops you can do and not even wind up in this place. And so you think I could get you to turn around and head out?
Well, I saw other tracks out here, so it's not allowed, huh?
Yeah, I saw those other tracks too. I was wondering where they came from. Usually when we do stuff like that, we'll also get complaints at the office. So I bet when I get back, I'm going to have a couple of phone calls to take care of as well.
Well, is there like a regulation or something against it?
Hey, yes, actually, as a matter of fact, there is a regulation. We do sometimes cite people with a ticket for riding in the area. You seem like you've never been here before. Really just kind of want to give you the benefit of the doubt and understand that you didn't even know what wilderness was. I'd offer also like jumping on the website, Wilderness Connect. It's a ton of information about what wilderness is. Even if you Google Rattlesnake Wilderness, which is where we are, you can find some information about this area in particular. Some great backpacking spots in here. But again, mountain biking is something that's not allowed.
Okay. Well, so I can get on my bike and ride out of here?
Considering that that's how you got in here and you need to head out, yeah, if you could turn around, if you see anyone else, I'd ask you to please step off your bike and let them pass, especially if you see any horses. We don't have a ton of horse use in this area, but any horse coming up, anyone riding a horse isn't going to expect to see a mountain biker because they know that mountain bikes aren't allowed here.
Okay. Well, I'll be on my way. Thanks.
Hey, thank you. All right, we can step out of that. I'll admit I didn't nail that one. And you did a good job as a visitor, bringing up some great questions. A great point about what do you do when someone has their bike? You're asking them to leave. Are you going to ask them to ride it out?
Yes. Walk it out.
Yeah.
I had to do that.
I remember back in the day having discussions about, can you take their wheel and make them push it out? And no. And to be honest, the regulation for the Forest Service is possession. And so it's not riding your mountain bike in wilderness, it's possession of it. And so you're not really solving that aspect of it. I think the visitor experience part, you can debate either way. Tim, I don't know, what did you think?
I've only had one bike in the wilderness, and we asked him to walk it out. It's only like a half a mile, but yeah, he did it. He was kind of surprised. He'd gone 4 miles just to get to the boundary, so it was pretty interesting. So he walked it out to the boundary and rode it.
It's a judgment call. Jack, do you have, you spend more time doing some of this stuff than I do. Any thoughts on that?
It's situational, right? I think you called it pretty well there. I see more tracks than I actually see people doing it, but I don't know. Yeah, in the situation where an individual doesn't know what wilderness is, it's all about that capturing that teachable moment, explaining to them what wilderness is, why those things are not allowed, prohibited, and try and give them a little wilderness speech, and then they walk it out, ride it out. Do you want to walk with that person and talk to them another 2 miles and keep telling them about wilderness? That could be an option.
Yeah, we put this guy on his honor to walk it out, and according to other visitors, he was. So it was pretty cool that he understood why also. But anyway.
Hey, thanks for volunteering, Tim.
Yeah, no problem.
Hey, so just want to open it up to questions and answers now, and then we'll start working towards wrapping things up. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. So any other thoughts from the group? For the resource technique, wisdom, making public contacts, doing scenarios, things we might need to start thinking about with some of this stuff that maybe we hadn't before. Nancy Kellogg, when confronting a visitor who is reluctant to comply, especially if there is not a legal option for assisting compliance, as in scenario 1, would using resources as a tool to support your argument help? In other words, how could, sorry, I keep jumping around. How could the resource adversely affect the visitor and what his transgression is? Does the trail become impassable to bikes? Is the camper by the lake more likely to have other campers or animals travel through his site because of his proximity to water? So I think I'm getting your point. Like, there is a shift, and honestly, a great example of this is dogs and people and their dogs, right? And I'm a dog owner, but sometimes you can, I find, speak as much as you want to the fact that someone's dog off leash may be harassing wildlife, but if you turn it around to, hey, your dog might actually be in peril because it's not on a leash, porcupines, other wildlife might get to it. That speaks more to some visitors. And the other end, I would say that's the art of it. That's not really the first place I would say you should go. I think you should try and, again, give them the benefit of the doubt that if you explain the resource, they'll go there. There's also a threshold on how long to talk to folks, right? At some point, it becomes more of a debate than it should be. And there's a time and place to say, hey, sorry, I'm sharing what I know. Obviously, you're going to kind of do what you think you need to do. And again, it might be a time to move on. I think that was kind of what you're getting at for both of those scenarios. If you could turn it around to their experience being changed, having people walk through your campsite is not going to be a lot of fun, right?
Hey, Jimmy, Morgan had a question.
Hey,
I was
Morgan.
just going to make a couple of comments. One, in terms of ranger safety, I don't think you mentioned this, but in my experience, you need to be really careful of inebriated visitors and probably steer clear of them, particularly if you're by yourself, because they can be pretty volatile at times. And then secondly, the other thing I just wanted to say was that I was a backcountry ranger in the NPS for a few years, and then have supervised a bunch of ridge runners who are like backcountry rangers, but with no law enforcement authority. And one of the big issues with them in particular, particularly if they are come back for one or more, a couple of seasons, is becoming cynical. I mean, it's just tough when you're out there and constantly running into people who are new to leave no trace, et cetera, and not operating as one would hope they would. So it's really important to try to figure out ways to keep a positive attitude if you're running into a lot of people who are less than optimal.
Agreed. Well said, Morgan.
To segue onto what Morgan just said, one of my old friends said, you got to realize that you see all the same things over again, but it's different people doing them. So don't think that you're not making an impact. It's often that you've got to repeat the same lessons because a lot of different people need to know them.
You bet,
Yeah,
Mike.
thanks.
Thanks. Morgan put it in, or Pete did in the chat box. Practice, practice, practice. Yeah, take time to do the scenarios, think through how you would address certain situations, use that kind of list of undesirable behaviors. And if yours isn't on there, think about the big why behind why are we asking people to do this, and be able to effectively explain that. And yeah, I think with that, I guess we just want to thank you for participating. And final words is hopefully wisdom and art will be with you throughout the field season.